The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a ton of different tests that are out there in terms of cognitive ability, and there's a ton of tests that are out there regarding finding one's place sort of on the political spectrum. And there's something called the cognitive reflection test, and the idea of it is to measure whether an individual person will override their immediate emotional response to something and give an alternative viewpoint further consideration. And we've talked for a very, very long time on the program about how very often presenting someone with alternative evidence, or rather, let me put it a different way, facts or evidence pointing to a different conclusion when it comes to political beliefs than their pre-existing position, often doesn't actually get people to change their minds. And in many cases, it can actually backfire. When presented with counter evidence, evidence pointing in a different direction about a political issue, many people will actually sort of plant their feet, stick their head in the sand, whatever analogy you want to use, and become even further ingrained in their own beliefs. One test determined, a study determined, that libertarians seem to score as the most analytical political group, most willing to reflect on and revise, or at least consider revising their perspectives when presented with counter evidence. The problem I have with the study is that someone claiming that they are willing to consider other evidence and change their views is not the same as someone actually changing false beliefs or beliefs based on incorrect data or facts. And I think that there's an element at play here, which is that different political groups have sort of different personas or ideas. One of the ideas that has started to float around as an example about classical liberals is that they are somehow outside of the political spectrum. They're above the political spectrum in some way, and they have an ability because they're not just, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative. There's this idea among some classical liberals that because they're this other thing, that they are sort of exempt from or can look at from above the normal intricacies and mechanisms of how people place themselves on the political spectrum. I think it's completely BS. I think basically classical liberals are pretty conservative, but they are sort of indifferent on social issues, and they've come up with this idea of being called classical liberals. Along the same lines, I think that many libertarians, and I'm speaking anecdotally, it's merely anecdotal, a lot of the libertarians we've interacted with seem to have this idea, again, that because they are not tied necessarily to the Republican Party and conservative beliefs or the Democratic Party and more liberal beliefs, that they are more objective in their analysis of politics. So I'm not at all surprised that in such a cognitive reflection test, libertarians would assert their willingness to revise their beliefs. I just don't know that the test actually tells us that they, in practice, do revise their beliefs.
That's true.
Claiming to be open to revising beliefs is not the same as actually doing it.
You know what I think it is? Most people aren't very political, although they may have an understanding of which side of the political spectrum they fall on.
Okay.
So they may have an understanding that I may lean to the left or I may lean to the right, but I'm not really too involved. If you identify as a libertarian, you already kind of know politics, because out of the general population, many people don't even know what that word means.
That's interesting, which is that there's some self-selection bias by virtue of which some membership in a group already implies more familiarity. That's sort of like if someone says, my economic views are those of social democracy. You're already self-selecting as someone who studied the issue enough to even know what that is. And thus, it wouldn't be shocking that those who consider themselves adherents to Scandinavian social democracy would be more knowledgeable about some issues, as an example. I think that's interesting, self-selection bias.
I wonder if libertarians are a little bit more ideological than people who fall on the left or the right.
They claim not to be.
Well, if there's let's say there's a mass shooting, I think a lot of people, liberals especially, would say, all right, we need fewer guns. It's like a simple solution to that problem.
Yep.
If there's like a crime committed by an illegal immigrant, people on the right will say we need less immigration, these like simple solutions.
Yep.
Whereas the libertarian may like take it a few more steps and try to like fit that in with their greater political ideology. I don't know.
I've not seen that happen. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. I've not seen it happen that way, but I think that I think the main point is the idea that it's an ideology that in and of itself sort of likes to see itself as really the thinking ideology. So that would be maybe why we're seeing some of these results in the test without it really being. It's an ideology like all others, and I don't actually know that these are individuals who are more open to change.
There's also a difference between like the Libertarian Party and libertarian in the sense as compared to authoritarian.
Like small L libertarianism.
Right. So like I identify as left and libertarian.
Sure.
We did that political compass test a while ago, and you fell around the same place in the spectrum as I did. So in that sense, I mean, I guess I'm happy with the results because I'm kind of a libertarian too in that respect.
Small L libertarian can also just mean you are for non-intervention by the government in certain issues and just letting people do what it is that they want. And that's where we get into the difference between sort of civil and social libertarianism and then economic libertarianism, which is often more associated with like laissez-faire, right-wing, non-regulation, deregulation, et cetera. Interesting study. I don't know exactly how much we learn about libertarians from it. Amazon.com stock continues to fall, and part of this has to do with Donald Trump singling out Amazon because they are not paying as high a percentage in taxes as Donald Trump wants them to pay, which could not possibly be more hypocritical given, number one, that Donald Trump has refused to release his tax returns, and we have no idea how much in taxes Donald Trump is paying, and number two, the fact that Donald Trump, when it was alleged during debates that he wasn't paying taxes or whatever it was that he was doing, he said, that makes me smart, that any individual would go through any legal means available to them to pay as little in taxes as possible. The hypocrisy with which this is taking place is stunning. And there's also sort of a broader concern here about the president getting so involved in commentary about specific companies that he's influencing stock markets in this way. And of course, the decisions of presidents in policy terms impact stock markets. We know that, right? But the singling out of individual companies in this way, I believe, is actually really cause for concern because it can almost become a sort of punitive power that the president might be able to wield with impunity in some way. And I find everything about this really, really concerning without being a defender of Amazon in any way, without being someone who defends the non-paying of taxes by corporations. What I'm pointing out is both the hypocrisy of what Trump is saying and the absurdity of getting involved in commentary in this way. He has no idea about the specifics that have allowed Amazon to do this. And his ideology actually supports some of the loopholes that allow companies like Amazon to do this stuff.
And I don't think he's just going against the corporation. He's also going against Jeff Bezos
it's
because Bezos owns the Washington Post. So it's very political, and it's also very anti-media. It goes into his fake news narrative.
It's the failing fake news Amazon, Jeff Bezos, Washington Post, which wrote bad about me many, many times, and fill in whatever other insults you want here. Yeah, it's just getting very, very stupid at this point, and it's embarrassing that this is what the president does and is doing.
And you have so many resources at your disposal to fact check some of this stuff. Like you could have contacted whoever the head of the United States Postal Service is to make sure that their revenue is down. It's actually up because of the online sales generated from Amazon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And a lot of people, that's a really interesting topic that someday we should look into, which is the arrangements that Amazon has with USPS, UPS, and FedEx are very, very interesting. And without making like a value judgment as to whether I think it's good or bad, it's just fascinating the volume at which Amazon is operating allows them to do incredible things, including now having their own fleet of planes for some of the big hub-to-hub deliveries that they're doing. It's just amazing what's going on. I
have a friend who works as a letter carrier for the Postal Service. And he says essentially now he's just working for Amazon because all the packages he receives are from Amazon.
It's amazing what is going on, and I'm not passing any value judgment on it, but from just someone who my background is in business, going to business school and being very interested in how logistics works, the entire Amazon shipping company industrial complex is an interesting one to study. Let me talk briefly about Joe Arpaio. He's the former Maricopa County Sheriff. He now is running for U.S. Senate in Arizona. He was already pardoned by Donald Trump. He is one of the original birthers who was going to undertake this just amazing and heroic, by his framing, investigation into President Obama's birth certificate, which he believed to be fake because the president wasn't really born in the United States. He's still not giving up on birtherism. He says that he's calling it when he's elected U.S. Senator. Other people are saying if he's elected U.S. Senator. There's sort of a difference of opinion there. He says he is going to go back to birtherism, and he is going to use the power of being one of the 100 senators of the United States to finally, once and for all, beyond any reasonable doubt, definitively confirm that President Obama's birth certificate is a fake. And I mean, this guy is just a laughing stock, right? And we don't think he's really going to be elected senator, do we?
He has 2 challengers for the Republican primary.
Yeah.
And I guess those are big names in Arizona.
Yep.
Even if he was to win, I think he would push the race so much. He would be so far right that people in Arizona would have to choose the Democrat, and
You
the
think
Democrat
so?
would get elected in Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, Arizona is typically a red state, but on average, they're not like extreme red. Although
Yeah,
I've
it's
been
like a
to some
pink
parts,
red.
I've been to some parts of Arizona that are pretty extreme red, and I've talked about that a little bit. But on average, the state is not like extreme red. McCain and Flake are sort of examples of that. Who are, I mean, they're right wingers, but they're not Ted Cruz, I guess is what I'm saying. I hope that this guy. Why does this guy even want to be senator? He's 85 years old. Does he want to be traveling back and forth from Arizona to Washington, D.C. constantly? Not that there aren't other senators in their 80s who do it all the time, but is this really what he wants right now?
I think it's just self-aggrandizement, especially after being held in contempt of court and having to get pardoned. I mean, that's embarrassing. So maybe this is his political comeback.
Yeah, let's hope he doesn't even win his primary. I don't even know when his primary is. I know most primaries are in early June, late May, but I don't actually know when it is in Arizona.
Yeah, we'll have to follow up on it. I don't understand what his end game is. Like, if we find out after all this time that Obama was actually born in Kenya,
delete him from the record books as president.
Yeah, like what happens? I understand if he was president and we found this out, maybe there would be a case for impeachment, but what would be the repercussions now?
Retroactive stripping of his presidency. I mean, it's so stupid at this point that it seems to be just a personal vendetta more than anything else.
Yeah, that would be like an athlete who we later found out used performance-enhancing drugs, like Lance Armstrong and Barry Bonds.
Now, let me ask, do you know what has happened with, like, Barry Bonds is a good example, where he had some, I think it was 73 home runs in a season, some record, whatever.
Yeah,
and then we later found out he was on steroids. Is there the equivalent of an asterisk on the record in some way?
Yeah, we do the asterisk thing. I think he had close to 800 home runs in his career. He surpassed Babe Ruth and then Hank Aaron.
Right.
But in the official record books, they put an asterisk next to his name. But we
How
knew
do you call it an asterisk?
Asterisk.
Oh, wow, I've never heard that before.
Okay. But we knew he was on steroids even when he was chasing like the all-time home run record.
It was pretty obvious, right? Yeah, it was pretty obvious. And then I know Mark McGwire also was on steroids. Did he have a home run record as well for single season?
He had the single season record, and I think Barry Bonds broke it a few years later.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and then Lance Armstrong was stripped of everything.
Even though everybody was on steroids in that field.
Yeah, and if you like look at the official winners of the Tour de France's that he actually won, there's just like no name. There's no winner for that year.
Oh, really?
For like the 5 consecutive years he won it.
I mean, part of the problem is that it's just sort of widely known that most of the people in the elite of bike racing are on steroids of some kind, performance-enhancing drugs, or doing blood stuff and whatever. I mean, I think I like the idea of just seeing what the natural talent allows for. I also think that the other angle would just be do whatever the hell you want. But the problem with that is that it will start to influence young kids.
That's nice, yeah.
Because they'll know at a certain point I'm going to have to start doing it if I want to compete. And that's just horrible. You know, that's the problem I have with it.
I think with like fighting, there are multiple different leagues. So like if you want to be an all-natural fighter, you go to the UFC.
Oh, okay.
But then they have like these like other off-brand ones who are geared towards people who are specifically on steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs.
Like what's one?
Like Pride was one of them, but they eventually got bought over by the UFC, and there are some like other fringe ones now too.
In the bodybuilding world, that's also a thing. Like all natural bodybuilding versus, I guess, what they would call normal bodybuilding, which is you're doing a ton of different steroids and stuff like that.
Right, and even that's, you know, like, does that mean that like supplements aren't allowed? Is creatine not allowed? Like, it gets tricky then.
Where do you draw the line? Yeah. All right. Well, I don't really have anything else to say other than there's a new show tomorrow, and I hope you'll watch.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.